So welcome to our second public webinar for the Professional Certificate in Media and Digital Policy in Africa, which is a collaboration between the Namibia Media Trust and Stellenbosch University's Department of Journalism. My name is Zoe Titus, and I'll be leading today's discussion. To provide some context, today's webinar precedes the launch of the live supported second course or second part in this program. So we hope today to share some insights from leading minds on the continent on the course content, which we hope will boost your grasp of regulation of media, the internet, artificial intelligence, as well as issues around access to information and data, the challenge of economic viability of media and strategic issues in campaigning for change. But allow me first to welcome and introduce Guy Berger, who has been central to the development of this course from day one. And Guy, please, if you're available, share some insights on the course, our objectives, what we hope to achieve.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure you want to get into the business, so let me be quick and I'll post in the chat a little bit of information. So this course, it's 4 weeks and it takes about two to 3 hours a week, and it's free. You just have to keep on clicking on the link that I've put in the chat, and then you can sign up for the free course. And it's going to cover regulation, and the importance of independent regulation for communications. It's going to cover the internet platforms. It's going to cover AI. So all these burning topics. And then it will also move into access to information and access to data, of course, being so important today. And then it will look at the viability of the media being still a very key part of the information environment. And lastly, it'll look into campaigns, court cases, how to monitor and evaluate your actions if you are involved in the space of advocating for better governance in Africa of the communications realm, especially digital communications. So hope you can all sign up, and please tell others. You'll see in the links there, it's there. And thanks, Chris, also for putting the details in.
Again, good day, people, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us. This session is meant to be an open, interactive conversation, so please feel free to share your thoughts and ask questions throughout. Please use the chat function to submit your questions. Our team will collect those, and we hope to be able to respond to them all during this limited time slot. Our topic today is digital regulation and democracy in Africa. As digital freedoms face increasing challenges across the continent, the role of laws and regulations in shaping democratic processes has become even more critical. So today we'll explore how digital regulations impact, for example, elections, civic engagement, and fundamental rights such as freedom of expression and privacy, for example. We have three fantastic panelists who will share their insights and experiences. Welcome, Juliet, Koliwe, and now Guy Berger. Guy, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to introduce yourself and give people some more, background. Juliet Nanfuka works with ICT policy an ICT policy think tank, SAPESA, which is the acronym for Collaboration on International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa. She advocates for free, fair, and open internet in Africa and has published widely and contributed to the work of various institutions on the issue, among them, for example, the Institute for Economic Thinking, INET, the Africa Digital Rights Network, and the Center for International Media Assistance. Welcome, Juliet. Koliwe Majama's area of specialization is public policy and governance. She has invested in research, building networks, and providing thought leadership on a myriad of internet and technological governance trends. She currently works for Mozilla Foundation as a senior program officer. And I may add that Koliwe and I know each other for many years, both having worked for the Media Institute of Southern Africa, MISA, more than a decade ago, when MISA was finding its feet and developing program in the area of digital rights and freedoms. And Guy, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to give a short introduction and background.
Zoe, as you know, worked for UNESCO for 11 years, doing communications policy, press freedom issues, and more recently, I've been doing stuff in relation to what's called the G20. South Africa will host the G20 next year, and it's about information integrity and what these countries might have in common. And I write about all these things on LinkedIn. I just wrote a thing this morning about media and the Global Digital Compact, which is a big agreement coming up at the UN in 6 weeks' time.
Mm.
So I wasn't intending to speak, but you have hijacked me into it, and I'm happy to talk a bit later in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Guy. We were originally going to be joined by Editon Ojo, who is a great mind and a very, very committed advocate for internet rights and freedoms. Unfortunately, here we have an actual practical example of the impact of these issues. Edit is not able to join us today because there's a 10-day nationwide protest over economic hardships, which is kicking off today in Nigeria. And he indicated when we communicated earlier that the government has been throttling the internet since yesterday. So that's the reason why his connectivity is very patchy. And yeah, unfortunately, he's not able to join us. It is such a pity because I know it would have added great value to our conversation. But with that said, let's get right into it. And I'm going to pose this question to you, Guy, having worked in media policy in various capacities over such a long time. How have you seen, how has digital regulation evolved in Africa over the past decade? And what would you say are its main drivers?
Well, Zoe, I'm glad that on this discussion, in fact, the person who set this up is Chris Kabwato, who is the engine behind Highway Africa, which was really dealing with these issues. And this Highway Africa started at a time when digital policy was really almost non-existent, but there was this exciting new technology there, the internet. And it was seen by the Highway Africa people as very much a chance to, open up communication, democratize communication, get journalism out there to people, get citizen journalism on the go, and outside the grip of authoritarian governments. And to some extent, that's still the case. But what we've seen is a number of governments have decided to catch up with this, and the most crude form of catch up is cutting off the internet, as we see in a number of countries. There are more sophisticated versions where certain apps are blocked temporarily or permanently. Of course, now that the internet is becoming so integrated into issues such as commerce, like M-Pesa in Kenya, it's more complex because if you cut the internet or throttle the internet, you actually are not just dealing with content, it's got economic implications. But in a nutshell, you've got governments trying to catch up. And at the same time, digital companies having been factors for, I think, democracy, human rights, and so on, have become increasingly controversial because doing their own thing means that they haven't really paid attention to providing safe spaces for minorities, journalists, for human rights defenders. They haven't done what they should have done in terms of human rights impact assessments to protect election integrity. And the result is that there's a lot of harassment, as everybody knows. There's amplification of disinformation. Okay, as well, just to wrap up, Zoe. So I think we've seen a sort of a moving thing here where governments, first of all, were outside of the internet. Then they sort of were catching up with fairly crude controls, prosecuting people using the internet, stopping people using it. And now there's another problem, which is that the companies themselves are in need of some kind of governance. And the question is, who will do that in Africa? And, you know, even it's hard for powerful economies like Canada or Australia to do this. And so where do African countries stand as individuals? Where will they stand in terms of the AU? Can they actually enforce, positive regulation, independent regulation of technology? And particularly now that AI is becoming so integrated with the internet.
Thank you, Guy. I wanted to hear, Juliet, would you like to elaborate on that? Because I think we really would like a more nuanced understanding of the drivers, be they economic, social, who the main actors are, aside from those that Guy has mentioned. Do you have anything to add?
So Guy, thanks for that, and great to see you all here, and congratulations on the course. So as Guy was talking, one of the issues that always comes to mind when you talk about digital regulation in Africa is that it seems to have evolved from a place of fear. When we look at the events of the Arab Spring and the myriad of laws and regulations that emerged after that, and which still remain in place today, to the detriment of press freedom, access to information, data privacy, and a whole host of other digital rights, we see that fear by the state, primarily authoritarian states, has driven the character and personality of regulations that we have come to see. But over the years, as users have evolved, have become more savvy, as the number of platforms that people have access to, and the confidence that has emerged at the same time with sharing information online, we have seen the rise of concerns that pertain to censorship, just building on to laws, some of them dating back to colonial rule, some of them dating back to post the Arab Spring, the early years, just after that, in the early 2011s, that period. In Uganda, for example, we had a myriad of laws that came out in those 2-3 years after that. Most of them detrimental to censorship, but really driving information control. We have also seen laws and regulations pertaining to surveillance and the absence of oversight mechanisms when it comes to data privacy and data controls. But over the years, we've seen a couple of countries enact data privacy laws, but not necessarily implement them. Another issue we have seen, but as Guy has also mentioned, has been the flourishing of misinformation and disinformation, which some of these laws have tried to address, but perhaps not in the best of ways. Instead, again, furthering the shrinking space for access to information, freedom of expression, but also for some of them creating open ground for the arrests of those who have opposing views, for those who might have but have not yet expressed an opposing view. So those are some of the issues that we have seen. But at the same time, we have seen some various attempts at trying to address these concerns. For example, in Uganda, we've had the Computer Misuse Act, which dates back to the post-Arab Spring era. And it's a law that has been used time and time again over the years. So we've seen that law used to shrink online spaces, to arrest and detain, sometimes with no clear indication for what the detention is actually about. People who with dissenting views, press houses, and sometimes the blatant abuse for the expression of truth.
Yeah.
particularly during times of elections and public unrest.
You mentioned the word that is very, very critical at the moment, especially since, 2024 is the year of elections. We've got 19 African countries. Well, some of them have already had elections, but 19 African countries having elections during the course of 2024. How has digital regulation, and please feel free, Juliet, Koliwe, and Guy, to respond to this. How has digital regulation impacted democratic processes, specifically such as elections and civic engagement across the continent? I think a major issue of concern for us all is electoral mis and disinformation. But please, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So we have seen, I think right now we are caught at a time of more uncertainty than clarity. We are caught at a time when there's extensive power dynamics at play, when we have growing forms of disinformation appearing, and they're getting more sophisticated. I'll keep referring back to the case of Uganda, which has very, very, very specific layout of the power dynamic, for example, between the state and platforms. Ahead of the 2021 elections, we had quite a lot of disinformation present in online spaces, which was transferring into offline spaces as well, and finding its way into media, some traditional, some online. However, we had, there was a report submitted, well, rather the state made complaints to various platforms about the presence of disinformation. They were pointing out a finger at opposition actors, not so much at themselves at the time. However, platforms took down the accounts of various ruling party actors, but did not take similar action against opposition actors. And in response, the state came out to question who has the authority within the state to decide who has the power to decide who is telling truth and who isn't. In this case, a platform decided that the state is the culprit when it comes to disinformation, despite the fact that that both parties, opposition and the ruling party, were involved. Despite the takedown of, rather, in spite of the takedown of those accounts which are pushing quite a lot of disinformation, in their absence, the disinformation perpetuated by opposition actors flourished because it wasn't given the same level of attention. And despite being equally savvy, so I think that is an example of the terrain that we're going into when it comes to trying to find a space to function when it comes to electoral disinformation, when it comes to trying to navigate online spaces, when it comes to trying to understand who has the authority to decide what, when, how. And again, it goes back to what Guy had mentioned earlier, who will govern the companies? And it's also a question that the state was asking, who governs the companies in instances when they decide that they have the authority to decide, well, to govern over us and what we do. So in the wake of that, Facebook was shut down. We actually experienced an entire internet shutdown. But today, Facebook remained disconnected in Uganda.
Thanks very much for that feedback. Guy, I'm sorry, I may be overemphasizing this, but this is such a critical issue that we are all dealing with, many of us are dealing with on the continent. In hindsight now, I mean, you've just recently had your elections in South Africa. In hindsight, what is your experience of how tech companies and the platforms have responded to issues of misinformation and disinformation? Have they done enough? Has civil society been active, sufficiently active in that space? Any comments?
Yes, and I see there's a number of other South Africans in the chat who I'm sure can well, in the participants who can add. But ever since the Facebook had this leaks by Francis Haugen about 3 or 4 years ago, it emerged that the company operates a tier system. So some elections are graded as tier 1 and some are graded as tier 4. And that means that they basically have differential treatment of the different elections. So an election that matters to them based on, for example, the size of the market, how much money they make, they'll put more resource into making sure their platform is contributing to election integrity. And other countries further down the list don't get that kind of attention, so it's more of a free-for-all. And that is even changing now, because it's evident that many of these companies have even retrenched the people who were supposed to be monitoring abuse of the platforms during elections. And so it's a bit of a free-for-all that exists now. At any rate, the platforms also have, all of them, signed up to what is called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which means that they have got some responsibilities towards human rights, like the right to an election. And under these guiding principles, they are supposed to do a human rights impact assessment before key things. And they're supposed to do it and communicate it and say what their threat analysis is, what their mitigations are going to be. And actually, it should also be that they have ways to measure the success of their proposed mitigations. So in the South African case, the South African National Editors Forum asked all the companies if they would share what their plans were for the election. And basically the companies didn't play ball on this. And so nobody really knew, are they going to be moderating content in isiZulu or Tshivenda or smaller languages and so on? Are they anticipating that there will be threats to particular journalists, and what will they do about that? Are they anticipating that there will be an attempt to discredit the election management body, the IEC, so that, as happened in the US, you get a big momentum then that says the election was stolen? So what were the platforms going to do in this? Nobody knew, because they wouldn't respond. And that was very disappointing, I think, and showed just a certain level of arrogance, in fact, and contempt for the interests of stakeholders, because in a country volatile like South Africa, with attacks on migrants and so on, intense politics, these could be matters of life and death, to know what, can we count on the platforms to do what they ought to be doing. And if they won't even tell you what they're thinking of doing, well, they're basically giving a free pass to people to use all kinds of incitement, hate speech, intimidation of the media, etc. And one of the outcomes of this eventually was that 2 NGOs then wrote to the companies and said, look, under the South African Freedom of Information Law, which is called Promotion of Access to Information Act, under this law, we're entitled to get this information. We're not just asking you, we're insisting as our legal right to know what you're going to be doing. And the companies then responded and said, well, we don't fall under your jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Now, these are companies that have offices here, they make money here, they have lots of adverts, and yet they said they don't fall under the jurisdiction. So now these 2 NGOs have gone back to the information regulator, which is an independent regulator, and they've said, please make a ruling on this. How can these companies function here? But they say they're not under the jurisdiction. So that's where it is at the moment. In the meantime, of course, the election has passed. Still, there are echoes and repercussions, because some people are still claiming the election was stolen. But and that still is going around on social media. However, I think that if this thing eventually comes to court, the platforms are going to say, well, it's a moot point because this is long ago, and so it's irrelevant. The thing is that what happens in the next election, or in by-elections, in other elections around the continent, and if that's the game they want to play, that they that they provide services, but they won't provide care or tell you about the care they're providing. That's a problem. And certainly those people who were researching what was happening on the platforms discovered a lot of information operations, a lot of abuse. There were some mechanisms to report some of this, and some of the platforms did actually cooperate with those mechanisms, but everybody was in the dark really about how effectively they were combating them, how much they anticipated them. Did they actually deplatform some of the people? Did they demonetize them? So these are the issues that are at stake at the moment in the wake of the South African election.
Thank you for that, Guy. That brings me to you, Koliwe. What role do you think international tech companies play in shaping digital regulation policies in African countries? I know at Mozilla you promote open standards and internet privacy, but please share some insights.
I wanted to add a few more issues, two issues related to elections, which I think are also very important in terms of digital regulation, and also the role that these platforms play in influencing public opinion during elections. And I think that one of the things that has come out, I think, as elections have been evolving, is that because there isn't much media and information literacy or digital literacy in general within the public, there are implications when there's paid for content on social media platforms. And if there is what we call micro-targeting, so online advertising during elections that would analyze personal data to identify the interest of specific people. And at the same time, because we're talking about the big tech, I think that there's also been quite a significant trend of the role that our mobile network companies are playing in terms of them distributing or sharing data. So there's lots of data abuse that we're seeing, especially during campaigns of political parties. And this is largely without the consent of the owners of that information. But I'll get back to big tech and say that I think that what has been very interesting to watch is also just how the popularity of social media platforms has influenced other issues relating to regulation outside the standards for fact checking. I think Guy was talking to mis and disinformation earlier, to also issues relating to mental health and online exploitation of public opinion, as it were. And I think for those of you who really follow very closely, you know that in the US, big tech companies have been called to sit before Congress to testify around the safety of minors as they're using social media platforms. But when you ask me in terms of the role that international tech companies play in shaping regulation here in the African context, and I see there's lots of people who have been in the space, we've seen a great shift where I like to say, and I hope none of my colleagues can hear me say this, but that social media platforms have recognized the need to have people such as myself joining their team so that they can actually include consumers and government agencies, as well as civil society organization in, the way that they're running, managing, or, just like having conversations around their operations or what it is that they offer. So we're seeing a trend in them coming up with government relations officers who were previously working with us in civil society. We're seeing community engagement officers as well. And this is actually an acknowledgement that the sector or the big tech companies are well positioned to educate and raise awareness of their users. And I think one of the things that I think about also is that but their role in that respect has to look at their adherence to appropriate parameters. And I think earlier Guy spoke to the principles of business and human rights. And I think one of the principles says something like the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So them recognizing the rights that they are supposed to be protecting, which would obviously be internationally recognized rights within our context here in Africa, looking at what our African framework looks like. And also, I think in terms of them implementing guardrails for consumer privacy. So tech, I think when we think about tech companies, largely in this context, it's usually, you're looking mostly at social media platforms, because I think that's what we use mostly in Africa. But I think there are other AI or tech platforms that are evolving within our national context. So I think recently we just issued a grant to someone who was looking at South Africa's social welfare or social grant process, which is being run on an AI platform. So as you see an increase in, just like the adoption of digital technologies for public systems or public welfare, I think it's also important to recognize that. And then for me, I think advocacy by the industry itself for what it is that they're looking at. So this afternoon, earlier this afternoon, I was listening I'm at the Africa Philanthropy Conference in Vic Falls, and we were listening to Dr. Abeba Behane, who was looking at AI within the sector of philanthropy. And one of the things she says is, it's unfortunate when you look globally at how big tech companies have captured regulatory processes. And what we see them doing is derailing important questions that relate to bias, things that relate to discrimination. And sometimes that's grounded in the fact that they don't actually recognize that there is something beyond their making money. And there is a benefit to understanding what the public policy developments in the specific countries look like. And that is actually smarter business. So I hope that answers your question, Zoe.
It does. Thank you, Koliwe. And whilst I have you, both Guy and Juliet earlier made comments around issues of privacy, invasive surveillance. I wanted to ask you, because I know this is an issue close to your heart. How can legal frameworks be adapted to protect citizens from invasive surveillance and ensure privacy and freedom? And because I know this has been part of your work, how can an intersectional feminist perspective inform these regulations to address power and dominant structure?
Yeah. I like this question because when I thought about it, I actually had to look for a certain friend of mine who's sitting in the room. I hope you don't feel like this is your response, because I'm going to reword it a little. I think it's just a recognition that I think with the adoption of technologies, there's been an increase in technologies that will ensure that people will be surveilled, whether it's by governments, whether they show it as or demonstrate it as something for the public good. So I think that recognition that surveillance is increasing and that there is need for us to continuously review capabilities, or rather the way that technologies are working. So if you have, for instance, an immigration system that is using facial recognition technology at the border, do we get to a point where after a certain duration, we can review the data that the way that we have trained it? Because you will understand that as technologies, as we use technology, they collect data and they learn from that data and start to give us responses that ideally demonstrate the nature of the data that they've been collecting. So I think that this would ensure that policymakers and people who are seen in the forefront of, just like digital rights activism, continue to look at legal and policy frameworks as something that's critical. And then I think for me, Zoe, in terms of you know, just the principles, the feminist principles. So for me, broadly, and I think this is probably for those people who are attending this webinar who are also part of the course, is I think that the Association for Progressive Communications did great work when they brought up or coined the feminist principles of the internet, because these are a standard that set a framework that are looking beyond gender, but to also articulate issues relating to sexual rights. And I think that's a big debate here. And I'm glad that Juliet is on this call because she was recently part of a research that was done by an organization called Her Internet that was looking at the reality of the LGBTQ community in Uganda and issues around power and dominance within this respect. So I'll only talk to one of the principles, which I think would address the issues of surveillance, and that's the principle of embodiment. And that one is looking at, you know, just like the relationships of different people with different identities and realities in terms of, okay, marginality, I live with a disability, it's physical, it's mental. How I relate to a system would differ from a woman who is based in a rural setting. And the three principles that I like within that arc of embodiment, the first one is consent. And I've spoken earlier about issues to do with consent in my contribution to the elections debate, but looking specifically at women's agency in being able to, you know, say it is okay for you to use my data for this. And I think under that is a lot of studies that we have here in Africa about women who are actually using period apps and how their data is being used elsewhere. The second is privacy and data. And I think that the one around privacy and data is the right to privacy and full control over your own information online at any level. And then the last one for me is anonymity, which is also very important if you look at the study that Juliet conducted, the right to be anonymous and to reject any claims that would imply that there is something wrong with being anonymous online, especially that it would actually enable you to be able to express yourself freely online, especially where we have limitations as we have in the African context on our sexuality. Thanks, Zoe.
Thank you. Thanks, Koliwe. I know that this is the time to take some questions, and thank you for those who have made use of the chat box. But I'd like to ask Guy a question, pose a question to Guy, and in answering that, I'm sure that he will already touch on some of the issues raised by our participants. Guy, I mean, you've talked about misinformation, etc. So the question here is, how do digital regulations address issues such as misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and cyber threats in African democracies? And here I want to bring in AI. How do AI technologies impact freedom of expression, particularly concerning content moderation on digital platforms? And what safeguards are necessary to protect this right? And I'd like you to, if you can take a moment, also answer that, making reference to this ongoing process now around the Global Digital Compact.
Well, let me start with AI. You know, AI, everybody tends to think AI is ChatGPT, but actually, I mean, that's a particular iteration of AI. It's called generative AI. It's generating content. But you also have recommender AI that is sorting, sifting content, and the social media platforms have very long been using that kind of AI, recommender AI, to determine what should go into people's feeds, what won't go in. So it's used for content moderation as well as for curation. Curation, I mean, they basically think, or their algorithms figure out what is going to keep people glued to the screens here, because the longer you can keep people on a platform, the more advertising you can sell and the more data you can collect. So they've been using AI for a long time already in this recommender system. Now you can say that that's AI applied to the distribution of content. Of course, there are different AI configurations you could configure so that the recommenders could recommend public interest content, not just the most sort of emotive content. But anyway, the way the platforms work, their business model is to use AI to distribute certain kinds of content that will keep people there. When you come to generative AI, that's in production. So it's producing content, as everybody knows. Now, the kind of risk today is that you've got people producing content there that's not of good quality because not accurate, or it may be abusive, such as non-consensual sexual imagery. They're producing a lot of stuff, and then that gets distributed. So you've got two areas that need to be addressed by policy and regulation now. And then underlying both these areas, the production of content, and we know that it's not always the best content, and the circulation, which is also not always the best content. Underpinning these is data, because basically the AI is being trained on data and is using whatever data it can take without permission even from people, whether it's data about what people like to follow in terms of social media, or if it's data like you're generating data with your posts, basically taking data. So underlying this whole issue is the data economy and who controls the data economy, because that's where the wealth and value is today. So I think that's an important area, that we can't just look at AI in isolation. We can't just look at platforms in isolation. We can't just look at data in isolation. We've got to see how these three spheres come together. How do you govern production of content? How do you govern distribution of content? How do you govern data? So those are three important areas, I think. And now, when I come to this question of misinformation, disinformation, and what can be done about that. So one of the problems with misinformation, disinformation is, of course, anonymity and or fake identities for information operations. And so there you have an issue, and there's some attempts to try and push for at least provenance to become more clear, so that you can see where content is coming from and you can evaluate it accordingly. And then you've got the whole issue around labeling, and whether companies voluntarily are going to label, if they can technically label, or if they can at least label some stuff. At the moment, it remains to be seen, but that's what they are talking about. But it's self-regulation, so nobody knows quite what their metrics are for success, what the investment in this thing is, and whether they're really going to do it, both at the foundation model for content generation and at the circulation level on the social media platforms. And in the face of that, some content is not just a matter of being labeled, but it's actually dangerous content. It's inciting violence, for example, ethnic hatred and so on, misogyny. What do you do with that? Because it's not enough to label that, I mean, it's even if you do have all the labeling, it's a question of this content violating the bounds of freedom of expression. So what is a proportionate response, and what is the necessary response, and what is the legal response? So I think in some parts of the world, like the EU, they do have some content regulations, and in Africa we have lots of content regulations. Some of them are not good. But people are putting emphasis on other areas of intervention. So the one thing is to create more competition, to break up these big companies that are not doing enough, but to make it possible for smaller platforms and smaller AI companies with different ethics, different standards, to get a foot in the door, so that they actually are producing and circulating content that is content that's making a contribution to democracy and development. So breaking up big tech, I think, is one strategy. And the other one is to go for interoperability, whereby at the moment, if you are on on one platform, you can't actually easily transition or message or communicate with another platform. And so it used to be like this with cell phones, that, if you're on one network, you could never communicate with somebody on another network. You couldn't also take your number and port it to another network. So there's pressure to do this, to create more pluralism and more ease for people to actually withdraw from a platform and join another platform. So these are not content regulations. These are industry-related regulations. And lastly is privacy, because if you have tighter privacy controls, then it means that the data economy is reined in a bit and you don't get such an abuse. And again, that's not immediately a content control, but it has implications about how people are using content and data to make money. So I think those are important areas to look at. Also, just to come back to the South African experience that I was talking about before. So the civil society approached the information regulator, which, as I said, is an independent body. In the meantime, there's another regulator in South Africa called the Film and Publications Board, which is not independent. It just reports direct to a minister. And this body was trying to muscle in on the content control during the elections. And so some of the civil society groups went to court to stop them. So this is a complex battle, because on the one hand, you want to get an independent regulator to crack the whip a bit with tech, at least with disclosure, if not more enforcement of their own standards about what content should be allowed or not allowed. But then you also have the problem of other regulators trying to muscle in that you don't necessarily trust that they will respect freedom of expression, because they're not independent of the government. They don't report to Parliament, they report to a minister. So these are some of the challenges there. And the last thing that you mentioned, and I'll just say half a word on this, is cybersecurity, which of course is such a huge issue. And it's not separate from misinformation and disinformation and AI, because these phenomena are more and more being used to scam people, and in more and more smart ways. And so this is one area where cybersecurity, it's not just about the action of planting viruses and hacking into computers and deep phishing and so on. It's kind of facilitated. It's it's cyber-enabled crime, because it's to do with cyber content that's building trust and stuff like that. And that's a big issue. And there, I think I come to the last area where governments can and should intervene, is in basically promoting user literacy, media and information digital literacy, so that people realize that these free services are not free because they're paying with their data, that AI services are not to be trusted, AI, generative AI, that your distribution services are manipulating your feed for particular interests, and also that you've got to be really careful about scams on the internet. I mean, this is such a huge issue, particularly around the continent, with fake jobs and fake sales and that is something that maybe activists haven't taken too seriously, because we've all been looking at freedom of expression. But the cybersecurity that really hits everybody on a daily basis, it needs a lot more attention, and we need to put that into the package.
Thanks very much, Guy. Jean and Avni, I hope that responded to your question. That was a good response to your questions. Bayano asks, and I'm putting that to our speakers, what should civil society do in an instance where the intelligence services intercept communications from citizens, especially those who are critical of government policies? Juliet, do you want to take that?
Right. Yeah, so I saw the question, and it's a very good question, because it's something that we're perpetually grappling with. However, for many countries, interception of communications has been embedded in many of the laws, and it's deeply so. What's worrying is the absence of oversight mechanisms in some states. In other instances, there is the call for the respect of oversight mechanisms. However, in practice, that is not always the case. So we have seen rampant surveillance, particularly during times of public protests. But even during times of relative normalcy, There is the concern that there is surveillance. We've had journalists come and report that they have had Pegasus embedded and therefore Pegasus is surveillance software. And this is outside of election periods, outside of protest. But these are simply individuals who hold critical or opposing views of what the state is doing, or what individuals within the state are doing. So we see the selective use, or rather targeted use, of surveillance mechanisms. But more worryingly is the presence of third-party softwares that we have been seeing in recent times. Quite often we see fingers pointed at China, but a whole lot more countries are also involved in surveillance practices in the continent. That's the underbelly of the discussion around interception and surveillance. So we are seeing the collection of a lot of data. We are seeing a lot of excitement also about issues such as smart cities, where we're seeing the cameras coming in, under the guise of ensuring protection and safety in urban areas. But the underbelly of that is a whole host of mass data collection. We don't see those services used to truly protect, but not too often at least, but further monitoring movements of particular individuals. Again, pretty much like the more direct interception of phone online communications. So alongside that, it goes back to what Koliwe was talking about, was the mental aspect of it all. We're seeing some people not truly deliver on the stories they'd like to, because of the perception that the information is being intercepted. So where a story could be a whole lot bigger, we not necessarily get that, which is coming at the detriment of true journalism, of true, breaking stories, factual information, because of that heavily embedded perception that is fueling self-censorship, which is, I guess, part of the architecture of a whole lot of the laws that we see. And even the practice of the laws, the arrest and all of that, it has quite a strong influence on self-censorship, which is unfortunate. Yeah, so our work around surveillance has really been interrogating that, and I included in a link some of the reports that we have done. And we do recognize its existence, not only in Africa, but across the board. We just require it to be necessary and proportionate and follow the required mechanisms to, if it's to be put in practice. And a bit more transparency on what is happening there, not only by the state, but also by platforms who release information. It's not enough to simply get a transparency report that tells you some of the story, but not the full story, the type and nature of information that's being requested. We need a whole lot more information to validate that they're actually doing the right thing. So again, we have the intersection, or rather the intersection of states and platforms when it comes to concerns around surveillance practices. Some attempt at being proactive on the side of platforms, but growing heavy-handedness or perception of heavy-handedness by the state, particularly in authoritarian states, where some individuals in government have openly said, we will find you, we know what you're doing, we know what you're saying. But in so doing, again, fueling that culture of self-censorship at a time when we much need the information that could possibly and should be out there. Hope that answers the question. But yeah, please have a look at the link that I shared. There's a whole host of information in there.
Thank you, Juliet. We are running to the end of our session, but I hope, Juliet and Koliwe, that you will bear with me, because I've got to be particularly kind to Guy, because I just roped him in at the last minute. Guy, I would like, if you would just take a minute to tell us about this new emerging coalition on access to data. I think it's very relevant for this discussion today, for this platform, and we hope that more supporters will come on board. Please go.
So Zoe, as you said, there's an alliance for access to data, and anybody who's interested in joining it, please email me. I'll pop my email in the chat. And we need to raise this voice because in other parts of the world, journalists and researchers are getting access to data so they can monitor and call to account big tech. And Africa, of course, is not on the agenda as yet. And so it's important to raise that. Zoe, I see that we did have a hand raised by Dimakatso Mashile from South Africa's Department of Communication and Digital Tech. I wonder if you want to just ask him if he wants to make his comment. And
he's still with us, I'm sure.
Dimakatso, I saw your hand raised and I saw that you were still there. No.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Anyway, well, that's it from me. But I think it'd be really great to get a parting thought, perhaps if we can beg people a few more minutes from Koliwe and Juliet, and thank you.
Okay. Koliwe, parting thoughts?
Okay. Oh, I'm a bit in a daze because I'm in this panel with the Guy and Juliet. No, I think for me, just to add on to the question on civil society. So in your opening remarks, or when you introduced me, Zoe, I think one of the things you said was that we worked for 10 years or like over a decade. I think one of the things that civil society actually needs to accept is that with the spread of the internet, and also just the way it's not as siloed, everything is interconnected now. So identifying whether you're a civil society organization working with women's rights issues, we can make the social justice related issues in the way that people are continuously using technologies, and that we have to keep up the advocacy. So we were talking about access to information from the time that I see one of my past directors, Rashwit Mkundu, is here. In early 2000, we were getting arrested for posters on, demanding access to information and freedom of expression. But we only got to a point where we had laws in place that actually guaranteed it. But at the same time, when you look at the implementation of the laws themselves, I think civil society has a very strong role to play in monitoring implementation of the policies that we talk about. We also do have guiding principles that we have at regional level that look at very critical rights that allude or influence the use, design, and deployment of technologies, which would be freedom of expression and access to information, as well as privacy. Are we holding our governments to account? Do we continuously remind them? And for those of us who have the privilege of representing the broader civil society networks at platforms such as the African Commission, do we take those issues up so that they have the visibility and attention that they require? And then the last thing from me is, I think it's also important for us to continuously track or monitor or follow the work that's being done by civil society organizations at coalition level. I think there's been an acknowledgement over the past 10 years that there's been lots of money coming in to support internet governance related work, digital policy, but it's been done bite-sized in different national contexts. And then we probably now need to think about what we can do as a collective so that the issues that we've been advocating for at national level actually become or find themselves on the regional agenda. So those are my parting shots. Thanks.
Thanks, Koliwe. Our previous webinar was on networks and coalition building, and I recall now the central role that you played in AFDEC, the African Decoration Network, which brings me to Edison, who unfortunately, as you know, can't join us today, and his very, very important work in shaping the Declaration on Internet Rights and Freedoms, and the current discussion, ongoing discussion about the need potentially to update that declaration to deal with, the evolution of the internet and all these issues that we're dealing with. But and I will stand by what you said. Civil society has been very, very central to policy debates, and the evolution of the entire discourse on information and internet rights and freedoms. Juliet, your parting thought.
I think today on Koliwe's wavelength, we seem to be echoing each other. But yeah, everything that Koliwe has said, times have evolved indeed. But in more recent years, I think with the recognition of the amount of users in online spaces, the evolution of technology, we've been seeing a rise in coalitions, a rise in various guidelines and principles, but perhaps not so much tighter documentation of what happens after the emergence of these guidelines. I'm particularly interested in following up on what's come of the principles and guidelines for the use of digital and social media in elections in Africa. This was launched in South Africa. What's come of that this year? We also had, and as Koliwe alluded to, the African Commission on Human Rights document on access to information in elections in Africa. We also had the UNESCO partnership with the National Cohesion and Integration Commission in Kenya, which have been running the Social Media for Peace project. All these things going on, do we get caught up in the moment of announcement and then forget about it? What comes of them? I think that is one area where civil society needs to, we need to track what's happening with all these emerging documents and guidelines. What impact are they doing, and are we actually truly getting involved or simply jumping onto the next? But I'm glad to see this as part of the course, and it's exciting to see that the community interrogating this is growing by the day. So I think we're on the right track. But yeah, so that would be what I'm calling for. Let's keep track of what is happening, keep our fingers on the pulse with all these emerging documents, and see if the impact is there. It's not necessarily going to be immediate, definitely, but I think we need to hold various entities to account, including ourselves as various actors in this community.
Thank you so much. So as we come to the end of our webinar, I'd like to thank Juliet, Koliwe, and Guy for your really, really valuable insights, and our audience for your active participation. Today's conversation highlighted the important issues on digital regulation and democracy in Africa. But before we close, I'd like to leave you with a thought. I think it's now even more evident that the intersection of digital regulation and democracy in Africa now is presenting even greater challenges and opportunities, and that effective regulation must balance security, innovation, while protecting fundamental rights. And as civil society, most of us here being from civil society, it's up to us, policymakers, advocates, and citizens to push for policies that promote, ideally, transparency, accountability, and inclusivity in the digital space. So thank you for staying on for longer. Please do keep an eye on our social media platforms, particularly X and LinkedIn, for updates on future webinars. Thank you all, and I look forward to our continued dialogue and collaboration. Have a great rest of the day.